The weight of dust. The summer of 1893 brought drought to the coalfields of southern Illinois, and with it a silence that settled over the miners' rows like ash. Thomas Brennan stood in the doorway of the company house, watching his father's coffin being carried down the dirt road on the shoulders of 4 men whose backs were already bent from years underground. He was 17 years old, and he understood that his childhood had ended 3 days ago when the timber gave way in shaft number 7. "You'll need to see Mr. Hutchins at the company office tomorrow morning," his mother said behind him. Her voice carried no emotion. She had learned, as all the miners' wives learned, that grief was a luxury they could not afford. "They'll expect you to take your father's place." Thomas turned to look at her. Mary Brennan stood at the stove, her hands red from washing, her face lined, though she was not yet 40. His 2 younger sisters sat at the table, Ellen and Catherine, 10 and 8, their eyes still swollen from crying. "I know, Ma," he said. That night, Thomas lay on the thin mattress he shared with his brother Patrick, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Patrick, at 15, had already worked in the mine for 2 years as a trapper boy, opening and closing the ventilation doors in the darkness. He slept soundly, exhausted from the day's work and the funeral. Thomas could not sleep. He thought about the mine, about the darkness that swallowed men at dawn and sometimes did not give them back. His father had worked underground for 23 years. Thomas had always known this day would come in one form or another. The mine took everyone eventually. He thought about running, taking what little money they had saved and boarding a train to Chicago or St. Louis or anywhere the coal dust didn't coat every surface and every lung. But he thought also of his mother's hands, of Ellen's thin shoulders, of Catherine's cough that came every winter and lasted longer each year. By morning, he had made no decision because there was no decision to make.
Into the dark. The company office smelled of tobacco and damp paper. Mr. Hutchins, the mine superintendent, sat behind a desk piled with ledgers and forms. He was a thick-necked man with a gray mustache and eyes that held no particular cruelty, but no particular kindness either. "Your father was a steady worker," Hutchins said, not looking up from his papers. 17 years without a serious incident until this one. The company appreciates his service." Thomas said nothing. He had learned from his father that men like Hutchins did not want conversation. "You understand you'll be taking his place. Same wage, $1.50 a day. The company will continue to provide the house, deducted from your pay at $3 monthly. Any questions?" "No, sir." "Report to the pit head at 5 tomorrow morning. Jackson will show you what needs doing." Hutchins finally looked up. "Your father was 41 years old. You're 17. You could have 30, 40 years ahead of you down there if you're careful and lucky. Most men are neither. Try to be both." Thomas walked back through the town, if it could be called a town. It was a collection of identical wooden houses built by the company, a company store where miners bought their goods on credit against their wages, a saloon, and a Methodist church. Everything belonged to the Consolidated Mining Company. The houses, the store, even the church building, though the company allowed the congregation to worship without interference. He found his friend Joseph Murphy sitting on the steps of the company store, whittling a piece of pine wood with a penknife. "So?" Joseph asked. "I start tomorrow." Joseph nodded. He had been working in the mine since he was 14, after his own father lost an arm in a roof collapse. "It's not so terrible once you get used to it. The dark, I mean. That's what gets to most men at first, feeling like you're buried before you're dead." "That's a comfort," Thomas said. "I'm not trying to comfort you." Joseph closed his knife and stood. "I'm telling you the truth, which is better. The first week, you'll think you can't bear it. The second week, you'll think the same. But then something changes. You stop fighting it. You just do the work." Thomas sat down on the steps where Joseph had been. "Is that what my father did? Stopped fighting?" "Your father was a good man who did what needed doing for 23 years. There's no shame in that." There's no glory in it either. Joseph was quiet for a moment. No, he said finally, there's not. But glory's not what keeps your sisters fed.
The arithmetic of survival. The mine was everything Thomas had feared and nothing he had imagined. The first shock was the descent, dropping down the shaft in an open cage with a dozen other men, the daylight shrinking to a point above them and then disappearing entirely. They descended 400 feet in less than a minute, and Thomas's stomach seemed to remain at the surface. The second shock was the darkness. He had known it would be dark, of course, but he had not understood what darkness truly meant until he stood in a tunnel where no light had ever been except what men brought with them. The small flame on his safety lamp pushed back the black perhaps 6 feet in any direction. Beyond that was nothing. The third shock was the weight. Not the physical weight, though the air was thick and hard to breathe, but the psychological weight of knowing there were 400 feet of earth and rock above his head, held up by wooden timbers and faith. Jackson, the shift foreman, was a lean Welshman who had worked in mines since he was 9 years old. He showed Thomas how to load coal into the carts, how to read the sounds the timber made when it was about to fail, how to move efficiently in the cramped spaces. "You're young," Jackson said, his accent turning the words musical despite their content. "Your back will hurt for the first month, your hands will bleed, you'll cough black every morning, but the body adapts. It's the mind that's the real problem." "What do you mean?" "Some men go down once and never come back. They'll quit, starve, move on, anything but face this again. Others come back every day but never really accept it. They're fighting the mine every minute they're down here, and that's what breaks them. The mine always wins that fight." "And the third kind?" Jackson looked at him with eyes that reflected the lamp flame. "The third kind learns to work with the mountain instead of against it, learns to respect it. Those are the ones who last." Thomas worked that first day until his hands bled through his gloves, until his back felt like it would break, until the darkness seemed to seep into his skull. When the cage lifted them back to the surface at the end of the shift, he stumbled out into the afternoon light and vomited in the yard. Several of the older miners walked past him without comment. They had all done the same on their first days. He collected his lamp ticket and walked home slowly, trying to wash the coal dust from his face at the pump outside the house. His mother took one look at him and said nothing, but she placed his dinner in front of him with a gentleness that was rare for her. Patrick looked at him with something between sympathy and relief. Relief, Thomas thought, that he was not the eldest, that the full weight had fallen on someone else's shoulders.
The price of coal. The weeks passed into months. Summer faded to autumn, and the work continued with brutal regularity. 5 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, 6 days a week. Sunday they rested, though rest was a generous term for the exhausted stupor that claimed Thomas each Sabbath. The wage was calculated by tonnage. Each man paid by how much coal he loaded. The company provided the tools, the powder for blasting, the timber for shoring, and deducted the cost from each miner's pay. By the time the deductions were made for rent, for supplies from the company store, for the doctor fund and the burial fund, Thomas took home perhaps $30 a month. It was barely enough. His mother managed the money with an accountant's precision, but there was no room for error. When Catherine's cough worsened in November, the doctor's visit cost $2 they could not spare. When Patrick needed new boots for winter, Thomas wore his own pair until the soles separated completely. He began to understand something his father had never spoken of, that poverty was not simply the absence of money, it was a grinding daily calculation. It was choosing between medicine and food. It was watching your sister cough through the night and knowing you could not afford to keep her warm enough. It was wearing clothes until they fell apart and eating less so that others could eat enough. In December, there was an accident in shaft number 3. A gas explosion killed 6 men and injured a dozen more. Thomas knew two of them, Frank Morrison, who had worked beside his father, and young Billy Hart, who had started in the mine the same week as Thomas. The company held a brief service. The Methodist minister spoke of God's will and the comfort of heaven. The widows wept. The children stared with hollow eyes. And the next morning, everyone who could still walk went back down into the dark. Thomas began to feel something growing inside him. Not quite anger, not quite despair, but something closer to cold comprehension. This was the world. This was how it worked. Men went into the earth, and some came back, and some did not, and the coal continued to flow to the cities where people who would never see a mine used it to warm their houses and power their factories. One evening in January, Joseph found him sitting alone behind the company store, staring at nothing. "Thinking of running?" Joseph asked. Thomas had not spoken to anyone about his thoughts, but Joseph had always been able to read him. "Would it matter?" "No, they'd just replace you, same as they'll replace Billy Hart, same as they replaced your father." Joseph sat down beside him. "But that's not why you won't run." "No? You won't run because you're not the kind of man who runs. Your father wasn't either. It's in the blood, I suppose." "That doesn't sound like a blessing." "It's not," Joseph said, "but it's not a curse either. It's just what is." The Union Man. In March of 1894, a stranger came to town. His name was William Graves, and he was an organizer for the United Mine Workers of America. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with a confidence that seemed out of place in the coal camp. He wore a decent suit, and his hands, while calloused, were not black with coal dust. He had been a miner once, he said, in Pennsylvania, before dedicating himself to the cause of labor organization. The company did not want him there. Mr. Hutchins made that clear at a meeting in the yard outside the mine office. "This man is a troublemaker," Hutchins announced to the assembled miners. "He's here to fill your heads with ideas that will only lead to suffering. The company has always treated its workers fairly. We provide steady work, housing, credit at the store. What more could you want?" "We want justice," Graves said, his voice carrying across the yard. "We want fair wages. We want safe working conditions. We want to be treated as men, not mules." The miners shifted uneasily. Some looked interested, others looked afraid. All of them knew that men who caused trouble for the company had a way of finding themselves without work. That night, Graves held a meeting in the Methodist Church. The minister, Reverend Patterson, was a cautious man, but he believed in the gospel's teachings about justice for the poor. He allowed the meeting on the condition that it remain peaceful. About 40 men attended. Thomas went, though his mother warned him against it. Graves spoke for an hour. He talked about other mines where unions had won better wages and shorter hours. He talked about solidarity, about how the company could not run the mine without the miners, and if the miners stood together, they had power. "I know you're afraid. You're afraid you'll lose your jobs, your houses, your livelihoods. That fear is real, and it's justified. The companies count on that fear to keep you in line. But I'm here to tell you that there's something more powerful than fear, and that's the courage that comes from standing with your brothers." Thomas listened, and part of him wanted to believe, but another part, the part that had learned the arithmetic of survival, knew that courage did not pay for medicine or food. After the meeting, as men filed out into the cold night, Joseph pulled Thomas aside. "What do you think?" Joseph asked. "I think he makes it sound simpler than it is. Maybe, or maybe we make it more complicated than it needs to be." Thomas looked at his friend. "You're considering this?" "I'm tired, Tom. I'm 20 years old and I already feel like an old man. I'm tired of barely surviving while the company counts its profits. So yes, I'm considering it." They walked home in silence, each man alone with his thoughts. The cost of courage. The union drive began slowly. Graves held meetings twice a week, and attendance grew. Men began to talk more openly about grievances, about the short waits on the scales that measured their coal, about the dangerous conditions, about the endless debt to the company store. The company responded with quiet efficiency. 3 men who had attended the meetings were told their services were no longer needed. Their families were given 1 week to vacate company housing. The message was clear. But instead of crushing the union sentiment, the firings seemed to harden it. More men began attending meetings. Talk turned from grievances to action. Graves suggested they demand recognition of the union and a 10% wage increase. If the company refused, they would strike. Thomas found himself pulled in two directions. He saw the justice in what Graves said. He felt the weight of his own exploitation, the way the company took more than it gave, the way it reduced men to mere instruments for extracting coal. But he also saw his sisters' faces. He calculated how long they could survive without his wages. He thought about the evictions he had witnessed. At a meeting in early April, Graves called for a vote. Would they form a union local and present their demands? Hands went up around the church. Joseph's hand went up. Thomas looked at his own hand, resting on his knee, and felt the weight of choice. He kept his hand down. The vote carried anyway. 37 men voted to form the local. 8, including Thomas, abstained. After the meeting, Joseph confronted him outside. "You're afraid," Joseph said. It was not an accusation, just a statement. "Yes, I'm afraid, and you should be too." "I am, but I'm more afraid of spending the rest of my life like this, breaking my back for wages that barely keep me alive, watching men die for the company's profits, having no say in my own fate. And if we strike and lose, what then?" "Then we'll have tried," Joseph said. "That has to count for something." Thomas wanted to ask if trying counted anything when your sisters went hungry, but he said nothing. The distance between them seemed suddenly vast, though they stood only a few feet apart.
The breaking point. The company's response came swiftly. The day after the union vote, Mr. Hutchins posted a notice at the mine entrance. Any man who joined the union would be immediately terminated. Any man who participated in a strike would be blacklisted. Their names would be sent to every mine in the region, ensuring they would never work in coal again. That evening, 12 men went to the company office and renounced their union membership. They were allowed to keep their jobs. 25 men did not renounce. On April 15, 1894, those 25 men did not report for work. They stood instead at the mine entrance with signs that read "Fair Wages" and "Safe Conditions" and "Union Rights." The company brought in replacement workers from Kentucky, men desperate enough to cross a picket line. The strikers shouted at them but did not use violence. Graves had been clear that any violence would destroy their cause. Thomas went to work that morning. He walked past his friend Joseph, past men he had known his entire life, and descended into the mine with the replacement workers and the men who had broken the strike. The look on Joseph's face, not anger but something worse, something like disappointment, stayed with Thomas throughout his shift. For 2 weeks, the strike continued. The company showed no signs of negotiating. The strikers began to run out of money. Some families left town, seeking work elsewhere. Others survived on credit that would take years to repay. Then, on May 1st, the company made its final move. The 25 strikers and their families were evicted from company housing. They had 48 hours to gather their belongings and leave. Thomas watched from his doorway as Joseph's family loaded their possessions onto a borrowed wagon. Joseph's mother was crying. His younger brothers sat in the wagon bed, confused and frightened. Joseph saw Thomas watching and walked over. "I don't blame you," Joseph said. "You did what you thought was right for your family. I did what I thought was right for all of us. Maybe we were both wrong. Maybe there was no right answer." "Where will you go?" Thomas asked. "St. Louis, maybe. My uncle has a factory job there. It won't be coal, at least." Joseph held out his hand. "Take care of yourself, Tom." They shook hands, and Thomas felt something break inside him, not dramatically, but quietly, like a timber giving way in an empty tunnel. The weight of compromise. The strike ended. The union was broken. William Graves left town, moving on to other coal camps where the same battle would be fought with the same probable outcome. Life returned to what passed for normal. Thomas went back to his routine, down at 5, up at 2, home to eat and sleep and do it all again. But something had changed in him. He began to notice things he had trained himself not to see. The way Mr. Hutchins rode past the miners' rows in his fine carriage while children played barefoot in the dirt. The way the company store charged twice what the same goods cost in the neighboring town. The way injured men were discarded like broken tools. He began to read. The Methodist Church had a small library, mostly religious texts, but also some history books and collections of essays. He read about the Revolution, about men who had risked everything for principles. He read Frederick Douglass's autobiography and felt shame at his own timidity. He read about the Haymarket affair in Chicago, about workers who had died demanding an 8-hour workday. His mother noticed the books. "Reading won't put food on the table," she said, not unkindly. "No," Thomas agreed, "but maybe it will help me understand why there's so little food on the table to begin with." She looked at him sharply. "Don't start thinking like Joseph Murphy. Look where it got him." Joseph stood up for what he believed in. "Joseph is sleeping in a tent city outside St. Louis, last I heard. His mother is taking in washing to keep the family fed. That's what believing in things gets you." Thomas said nothing, but he continued reading. In June, there was another accident. A fall of rock in shaft number 5 killed 2 men and seriously injured 3 others. One of the injured men was Sam Weaver, who had been a friend of Thomas's father. Thomas visited Sam in his bed. His leg had been crushed beyond saving, amputated at the knee. His wife sat beside him, her face drawn with worry. "The company's letting me keep the house for 3 more months," Sam said. His voice was thin from pain and laudanum. "After that, they want it back. Can't work, can't pay rent, can't stay. Simple arithmetic." "Where will you go?" Thomas asked. "St. Louis, maybe. My uncle has a factory job there. It won't be coal, at least." Joseph held out his hand. "Take care of yourself, Tom." They shook hands, and Thomas felt something break inside him. Not dramatically, but quietly, like a timber giving way in an empty tunnel. Small acts. Thomas did not become a union man. He did not make speeches or organize meetings, but he began to do small things, acts so minor they seemed meaningless in isolation. When new miners started, young boys barely 14, Thomas took time to show them how to work safely. He demonstrated how to check timbers, how to recognize dangerous gas, how to move efficiently without taking unnecessary risks. When the company scales short-weighted men's coal, a common practice that stole perhaps a dime or two from each day's wages, Thomas began keeping careful records. He noted the weights the company claimed versus what he believed he had actually loaded. After 3 months, he had documented consistent underweighing, amounting to perhaps $30. He wrote a letter to the state mine inspector, carefully documenting his findings. He signed it anonymously and mailed it from the neighboring town. Nothing happened immediately, but 2 months later, the mine inspector arrived for a surprise inspection. He found several violations, including the scales, which were indeed calibrated to under-report weights. The company was fined $50 and required to recalibrate their equipment. It was a small victory, and most miners would never know how it had come about. But Thomas knew. He began contributing small amounts, $1 here, 50 cents there, to a fund that Reverend Patterson had established for miners' widows and injured workers. The Reverend asked no questions about the source of the money, but he acknowledged each contribution with a quiet nod. When Sam Weaver's family was preparing to leave for Indiana, Thomas went to his mother. "I want to give Sam $10. I know we can't spare it, but we have more than he does right now." His mother looked at him for a long moment. Then she went to the tin where she kept their money and counted out $10. "Your father would have done the same," she said. Thomas took the money to Sam Weaver. The man wept. These were not dramatic acts. They did not change the fundamental structure of the coal camp. The company remained powerful. The miners remained poor. The work remained dangerous. But Thomas began to understand something that William Graves, for all his passion, perhaps had not fully grasped. Change did not only come through grand gestures and strikes, it also came through the daily choice to remain human in a system designed to reduce you to a function.
The education of character. As 1895 turned to 1896, Thomas continued his education. Not formal schooling, he still worked 6 days a week in the mine, but an education nonetheless. He read more widely. The Reverend, impressed by Thomas's genuine interest, began lending him books from his own collection. Thomas read Adam Smith and found himself troubled by the invisible hand that seemed so visible in his own life. He read Henry George's Progress and Poverty and understood for the first time that there were men who had thought deeply about why some lived in mansions while others lived in shacks. He also learned from observation. He watched how Mr. Hutchins managed the mine, how he balanced production against safety, how he dealt with problems and complaints. Thomas began to see that management was not simply tyranny, though it could be that. It was also a kind of puzzle, how to extract maximum coal at minimum cost while maintaining enough safety and satisfaction to keep the workforce functional. This knowledge did not make him love the company, but it made him understand it. And understanding, he was learning, was a form of power. He also continued his small acts of assistance and subversion. When the company tried to introduce a new system of fines for minor infractions, Thomas quietly circulated information among the miners about their rights under state law. When a new foreman began treating the younger workers harshly, Thomas documented the abuse and again wrote to the mine inspector. He was careful. He never made himself a target. He learned to work within the system just enough to avoid suspicion while still pushing against its worst excesses. His brother Patrick noticed the change in him. "You're different than you used to be," Patrick said one evening. He was 16 now, filling out, looking more and more like their father had looked. "How so?" "I don't know exactly. Quieter, maybe, but also harder somehow. Not in a bad way, just like you're made of something more solid than you used to be." Thomas considered this. "Maybe I'm just getting older." "It's more than that." Patrick was quiet for a moment. "Joseph Murphy's back in town, did you know?" Thomas felt his chest tighten. "No. When?" "Yesterday. He came by while you were at work. Said he wanted to see you." "Did he say what he wanted?" "Just to talk. He's working at the lumber mill now. Says it's harder work than the mine, but the air's better." Patrick paused. "He said he doesn't blame you for what happened. Wanted to make sure you knew that."